spotlight of the day, concluding the four-day summit with Africa that saw 52 countries from the continent attending the meet, the largest delegation since the dialogue started 7 years ago. Prime Minister Narendra Modi announced a $10 billion concessional credit line for Africa over the next 5 years. His outreach is being seen by many as an attempt by India to play catch-up with China. But is this too little too late? I find out in this package. Listen in.
Today, it is not just a meeting of India and Africa. Today, the dreams of 1/3 of humanity have come together under the one roof.
Though Prime Minister Narendra Modi announced to the world that the strong India-Africa ties were beyond mere economic or strategic interests, the subtext of the grand meet was hard to ignore. Analysts say that a fortuitous confluence of factors has given India a golden opportunity to catapult its position as a counterweight to the growing influence of China in Africa. The Chinese economy, pegged to grow below 7% for the first time since 2009, could potentially not only temper demand for oil from Africa, but also reduce China's mega infrastructure spend in the region. To complicate matters further, recently farmers in Ethiopia and Zambia protested against large-scale land acquisition by the Chinese. The country's controversial support to rogue governments in Zimbabwe and Sudan has done little to change that perception. The world's second-largest economy has also been accused of not transferring adequate technology to local African companies, and therefore China's investments have done little to boost local industry. In contrast, India's engagement, though still very limited compared to China's, is being seen more favorably. For instance, under the Indian Council for Cultural Relations, New Delhi offers 22,000 scholarships every year, apart from training 100 officials from sub-Saharan Africa. But despite the promise, it would not be easy to eclipse China's influence in the region. In December, South Africa will host the Forum on China-Africa Cooperation, which is expected to be attended by the heads of all African countries, apart from Chinese President Xi Jinping. Expect big bang announcements from Beijing in that meet. In New Delhi, Ronojoy Banerjee.
So can India eclipse China in Africa? I'm now joined by seasoned diplomat Shyam Saran. Welcome to the show, Mr. Saran. Now we all heard the Prime Minister today making a very strong pitch for closer ties between India and Africa, and it was the largest congregation of political leaders from Africa since the summit, in fact, started in 2008. So would you say that the summit was a success in the sense of catapulting India's position as a key partner to the African continent?
Yes, I think it would be fair to say that it has, because as you yourself mentioned, that we have had virtually a full house as far as the attendance is concerned. We have virtually all the important African leaders who are represented in Delhi. And you may have seen the speech that Prime Minister Modi made this morning, where some very ambitious, cooperation plans have been announced. He has announced that for the next 10 years, India will be making available something like $10 billion in credits, concessional credits to Africa, that there will be 600 million of that in grants, there will be 100 million for an India-Africa Development Fund, there will be 10 million for a health fund. So if you look at what has been put forward by the Prime Minister, we are really looking at a very expanded economic engagement with Africa and a development engagement with Africa for the next few years.
That's right, sir. In fact, traditionally, if we have seen the relationship between the two sides, under the ITEC program, for instance, India has been supporting the development needs of Africa. In fact, even under ICCR, India has also been giving scholarships generously. But the sense really is that somewhere India missed the bus and there was a void that was created, which is what Modi is now trying to successfully address.
Well, there is, as I myself mentioned, that there is no doubt that this particular summit is a much bigger show than the two previous summits that we have had. The first one was held during Dr. Manmohan Singh's time in New Delhi. The second one was held in Addis Ababa in 2011. And in those summits, we did offer about $5 billion each in terms of concessional credits. And my understanding is that about $7 billion or so of that has actually been dispersed for various kinds of projects. So one should not say that nothing has happened before and that, it is only now that we are engaging with Africa. That's not true. You yourself mentioned there have been annual business conclaves between Indian and African businessmen. And the trade, if I'm not mistaken, has expanded to somewhere close to about $100 billion between the two sides. There is a lot of investment also taking place from India in Africa, especially ONGC has been doing a lot of prospecting work off the coast of Mozambique. There are a number of major Indian companies who are investing in a whole host of sectors in Africa. So I do not say that, we have not been doing enough, but there is no doubt that Prime Minister Modi has infused new energy, a new focus on our relations with Africa, and that is most welcome.
Well, surely, sir. In fact, many would say that the boost has also come in because for the first time we've seen there's a real alignment of many diverse interests now between India and Africa, from terrorism, climate change, and even perhaps the growing unease within Africa of China's growing economic hegemony and influence across the region. Will you agree with that?
Well, there has been alignment in the past as well, but as you yourself pointed out, that maybe the engagement has not been of the level that we should have had. And I think that is perhaps what is being addressed with this summit. But you mentioned the engagement of China with Africa. Yes, there have been some concern amongst African countries about the nature of Chinese involvement in Africa, basically related to extraction industries, basically related to raw materials, and perhaps not bringing enough in terms of economic benefits to the African countries. By contrast, India's record in Africa actually has been very good. We have focused attention mainly on capacity building. We have focused attention on building up the small scale industries in Africa. We have focused attention, for example, on agricultural development, areas which are important for the development of Africa, and particularly people-centered development. So I think the worst thing that India can do is to try and catch up with China in Africa. China has been able to do this project, India has fallen behind. Our strengths are different from China's. And I think the kind of engagement that we have had with Africa, which is much more broad-ranging, much more focused on education, much more focused on capacity building, much more focused on small-scale industry, agriculture, bringing Africa, to the digital age, in a sense. Prime Minister Modi has talked about how we must partner on the digital side. These are very substantial achievements by India, I would say, in terms of its development cooperation with Africa. So let us continue to do well in those areas which are our areas of strength, rather than try to keep looking at what China is doing there and try to catch up with China. I don't think that's a very good way of pursuing our relationship with Africa.
That's an excellent point, sir. So therefore, what you're saying is that India should not blindly follow China's strategy, which is, of course, making massive investments aided by deep pockets, but we should have a unique approach of our own.
Exactly. And it has advantages. It has its own advantages which China does not have. So let us focus attention on those areas of strength that we have.
So because the trade gap is still perhaps a bit of a concern, because India's trade with Africa is still valued at about $70 billion, whereas China's is about, 3 times higher?
No, it's about 200 billion, so we are not so far behind actually. There is, I think, a mistake in looking at China and India as alternatives for Africa. there is enough room, I think, for Africa to gain benefits in its cooperation with China in those areas which Africa feels it wants to cooperate with China, as well as areas of benefit in working together with India. So I think it is important not to sort of put our engagement with Africa in terms of what it means with respect to the triangular relationship with China, but really to treat Africa as a independent factor in India's foreign policy in terms of India's economic diplomacy.
My final question to you, sir. Do you think China would have followed the developments in India very closely over the past few days, considering that there is going to be the big China-Africa meet in South Africa in December?
Well, I think China would certainly be watching to see what India is doing with respect to establishing a greater profile for itself in Africa. But neither should it be seen in India as if there is a zero-sum game with respect to China's engagement with Africa. Perhaps you can even think in terms of China and Africa working together in some projects with respect to Africa through, for example, the BRICS Development Bank, or through other bilateral cooperation with China. So there is enough room for these two large emerging countries to also be able to work together for the benefit of China. I mean, for Africa, we should not think that there is necessarily a purely competitive kind of relationship between India and China as far as Africa is concerned.
Thank you so very much, Mr. Saran. We've got to leave it at that. Thank you very much for joining us on The Big Picture. So you heard from a seasoned diplomat as to how India can position itself uniquely in Africa vis-a-vis China.